For a medieval knight, sometimes a sword can be a far superior weapon to a polearm. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, I'm used to, on this channel, extolling the virtues of polearms, be it poleaxes, spears, bills, halberds, other types of pole weapon, because frankly, they don't get as much glamour and glory as swords do, despite the fact that the sword is probably the most famous and iconic knightly weapon, perhaps for good reason, and perhaps for reasons we might cover in this video. So the sword gets all of the glory, it's always the hero's weapon in movies and role-playing games and video games and things like that, whereas in actual fact we know that polearms and missile weapons were the principal weapons on the medieval and classical world battlefields. However, due to recent experiences, I have been re-evaluating in my heart how I actually feel about swords and how useful swords can be, specifically for the fully armoured late medieval knight. And this could be extrapolated to earlier periods as well, but we're going to focus here on the 15th century. So let's have a little look at the reasons why I think swords are actually far more effective for the armoured knight than perhaps even I'd realised before. Before I go on, I want to briefly mention that this video is very kindly sponsored by Established Titles. You can check out the link below now, or you can wait a little bit later in this video and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Established Titles. But now, let's get back to the main topic of this video. So first up, what is the background context that has made me come at this issue again? Well, quite simply, recently I attended the Battle of Tewkesbury reenactment, held, unsurprisingly, in Tewkesbury. I went there with various friends, some of whom you may recognise, Lindy Beige, for example, Draconiffle, both friends of mine. Also, Zachary Evans has his own channel, check that out. All friends of mine, and in fact, I was invited initially by Zachary Evans and also Nick Doran, who basically plays the part of the Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. And me and my merry band were invited to be bodyguards to the Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. And it was absolutely freaking awesome. I had a wonderful time. I also got loads of interesting insights, some of which will be filtering through into videos on this channel, and this, I guess, is one of the first of those. Now, while I was at the Battle of Tewkesbury, incidentally, it was very hot by English standards. I think it was about 30 degrees C, and we were wearing full plate harness, which is an interesting experience by itself. We might talk about that in a future video. Now, I've spoken about my preparations for this event, and I've spoken about spears. So you notice I did a lot of spear videos in recent weeks. And this is the spear that I was using, a octagonal shaft with a very nice reinforced head. This was originally a sharp spear that I actually chopped the point off, rounded it, and turned it into a blunt essentially. But it's a good quality spearhead, correct type, very reinforced mid-rib. So absolutely the type of spear that was used by knights in this period. And I also, you'll remember, did a recent video talking about the fact that a lot of people don't think of spears as knightly weapons, but in fact spears were often used as knightly weapons. And so while spears absolutely were used by knights, categorically, both on horseback and on foot, equally we know that sometimes knights chose to use poleaxes. Sometimes they use things like glaives instead of poleaxes, and of course they generally had a sword as a backup weapon. Now, the funny thing is that certainly if we look at period art, sometimes they're shown wielding a sword, but there's no evidence of the primary weapon. Now that can be for artistic reasons, but maybe not always. So on the first day of Tewkesbury, it's a two-day event, and so there's a battle on the Saturday, there's a battle on the Sunday. And on the first day, I almost entirely used my spear. Now, a funny thing happened. I did at one point draw my sword, and it was the same moment at which the opposing force had been given the command to retreat or retire. So I pulled my sword out and they ran away. No, it wasn't as simple as that. There were jokes made about that, but I pulled my sword out and I never got to use it on the first day. So therefore I decided that on the second day I was going to pull my sword out sooner so I could have a bit of fun with my sword, you know, in a controlled way, bashing on people's armour and things like this. And so on the first day I essentially fought in the lines with a spear, didn't really get involved in any single combat, which, you know, most medieval battlefields, this is obviously very different, it's reenactment, but most medieval battlefields would predominantly be fighting en masse with polearms or missile weapons if you were an archer. So I think that's realistic. However, we know that swords were used a lot, and we know that they were used in specific parts of the battle and specific situations. So anyway, I decided on the second day to use my sword, and I did use my sword almost extensively. In fact, I pretty much put my spear away. I gave it to someone who was with us, and it got taken to the back, taken to the rear with the gear, and I basically spent the whole battle using a sword. And that gave me more revelations than I expected to have. The first revelation was, this is a reenactment context, though there's no horror and death and maiming. I had a lot of fun, and I've got to say I had more fun using my sword than I had done with the spear. Partly that was because I was acting more as an individual. I was acting more, actually, perhaps, arguably, as a knight. So why might a knight choose the sword over a spear or a poleaxe? Well, there are two headline topics that I want to get into your heads, kind of absolute headlines to this whole issue that I want you to concentrate on for a second. Firstly, it is that armour changes everything. Okay, so when in the past I've made videos extolling the virtues of a spear, I have always pointed out there are two main things that really mess with all of the advantages of the spear. Number one is armour, and number two is shields. It should be perhaps no surprise that both armour and shields have been very prevalent on battlefields ever since each has existed. Shields in particular, because of course armour, depending on the type of armour, can be more or less complicated and expensive to make, whereas basically anyone with access to wood or even hide, leather, can make a shield. And the simple fact is that all of the advantages that I talk about, the spear, you know, reach and leverage and all of that kind of stuff, can be mitigated by the presence of armour. So particularly in the 15th century, if we've got someone who is fully plated, they don't have many openings. We'll talk more about that as we go on through this video. They don't have many openings to get to. They might have their visor up, so they might have, you know, and I don't have my bevel on at the moment, and very often that was quite common on the battlefield because you want to be able to see and hear and breathe more easily. You would take the risk of having your face open, and that does mean, yep, they've got an exposed face to thrust up. But that being said, anyone who trains with weapons regularly is generally quite good at protecting their face, okay? And you can see things coming in better when you've got your visor raised up. So in fact, you're less likely to be hit in the face because you can see better as well. Absolutely, there are vulnerabilities. You know, you might be talking about armpits, you might be talking about groin, or anywhere else there isn't armour, and the spear is a powerful thrusting weapon. So it does still have lots of advantages, and particularly used in groups and in formations, you don't have to swing it around. You can stand in essentially pike blocks with a bunch of other people and use these weapons very effectively, driving forwards, not only defensively against things like cavalry or other infantry, but you can drive forwards in a schiltron. You can, as pike blocks often did, you can use them aggressively as well, as Alexander the Great did, or going back into antiquity. So absolutely they can be offensive weapons, but the fact is that armour, if you've got a whole load of people in plate armour, spears have a negligible effect on them unless you can get them into an opening. Just thrusting someone's armour is not going to do anything at all, really. It might put a dent in it, and that's about the worst. Okay, so that's the first thing. Armour changes everything. The second thing is knights, so the fully, and I'm using the word knight loosely here because obviously technically a lot of them aren't actually legally speaking knights. They're men-at-arms, they might be squires or whatever. Or just gentlemen, but the people who are in full plate armour, who I am referring to as knights here, those are not necessarily, not always, very numerous in a medieval army. So, whilst a polearm might be absolutely the advantageous weapon to be using by and against the majority of the soldiers out there, it might be that if your knights are just the front rank of one particular battle, as they called it, one unit, or indeed if they're interspersed with someone like billmen or spearmen or halberdiers, if your knights, your ones who are in the full armour, are a minority, then that changes the game, because that means if you are a knight, but of the 10 people in front of you, only one of them is a knight, that means that 9 of the 10 people you're fighting against are going to be in lesser armour, they're going to be more exposed. And in that case, yeah, absolutely, your spear, you don't have to look for gaps necessarily. You can just thrust them anywhere in the face or body or arms and you're likely to wound them. Whereas that one armoured guy who you've got to watch out for, he might be behaving rather differently. Okay, so those are the two headline points I want you to remember when we're talking about everything which will come after that in this video, is that number one, knights, or the most fully armoured guys, aren't always the entirety of a unit or an army. They're sometimes a minority, although there are some exceptions. For example, Agincourt, where there was a suggestion there was a large number of knights, particularly at the front of each unit. So there's always exceptions, and different battles and different areas and different times are different. And secondly, the fact that armour is a game changer. Armour changes which weapons are effective. And just as another quick illustration of that, for example, something like the Zweihander, or a cutting sword, and we'll talk more about sword types in a minute, might be very effective in general against people, but not very effective against armoured people. Armour really changes the game. Now, of course, in this period, the people who could afford the fanciest armour were the lords, and I bet you didn't know that I am now a Scottish lord. That's right, thanks to established titles, you can now call me Lord Easton. And if you had any doubts about it, here is my very own proclamation from established titles, which you too can have one of as well if you check out that link below. Matthew John Easton, by the virtue of the ownership of land in Scotland, that's right, I now own land in Scotland, and shall hereafter to all and sundry be known as Lord Matthew John Easton. That's right, and you know, whether you take this seriously or whether you see it as a bit of fun, what a great gift to give someone as well. So how does it work exactly? Well, when you sign up, a square foot of land, at least a square foot of land, in Edelston in Scotland is purchased in your name. And when you're provided with your certificate, it gives you a plot number, and you can go online and actually see your plot from the air. Another fantastic part of this is when you buy your plot of land in Scotland, established titles pledge to plant a tree, plant woodland, for every order that they receive. So you're actually helping the environment, you're helping biodiversity all over the world. Established titles work with One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support global reforestation efforts. Now, there's actually a huge summer sale on right now with up to 80% off and a free gift, and you can claim your offer right now. But if you check out the link below, you can also get an extra 10% off with the code Gladiatoria, and that's special just for you, just for viewers of this channel. So if you check out establishedtitles.com/gladiatoria, or the link below, then you can get that extra 10% off. So if you want to become a laird or lady right now, or indeed give that gift to one of your loved ones or friends, or just do it as a prank or a joke for someone, then absolutely check out my link, use the discount right now. Thanks very much to Established Titles for sponsoring this channel and this video. So getting back to the main question of this video, I am not trying to tell you that polearms aren't great weapons. They are great weapons, but for each type of soldier in a specific scenario, there's going to be different priorities, different needs, different context. You know I was going to say it at some point. Now, for the knight on in the press, okay, if you know what that means, it means closely packed in body of people. For massive groups of people who are being pushed together, polearms can become problematic. It should come as no surprise that if you tried to use this big 8-foot spear in a crowded space, you might come into some trouble. And this is exactly one of the things that things like reenactment demonstrate really, really nicely. Absolutely, when you're fighting 6 feet away from the opponents and you're repeatedly stabbing them with your spear and you're defending against their spear, absolutely fantastic when there's some space between you. But what happens when someone charges in? Well, actually, funnily enough, it happens to me. Someone with an axe, and indeed I did manage to stick my spear in the way and block the axe that was swinging down towards me. So you can do things with these in close range, but a lot of the things you can do with these as an individual in one-on-one combat that I talk about, such as slipping the weapon back to shorten its reach. Look how little rather I've only got in front of my lead hand now. Great in single combat, but when I've got a whole load of people behind me, bam, or you don't even get that far, smack, and you hit someone behind you, sorry mate, I've just hit you in the crotch with the back end of my spear, and I can't shorten it anymore. Equally, using the butt end, so in single combat, I'll just switch over sides. In single combat, if someone knocks your point aside, one of the absolute simple techniques you do is you come around with the back end. You can come upwards, you can come downwards, but obviously I'm limited by the ceiling and other space here. But you can't do that if you've got a bunch of people either side of you. Now, The poleaxe, you'll notice, if I switch to a slightly, obviously the spear kind of exaggerates this problem, something like a pike even more so. But if I grab a poleaxe, now a poleaxe is a shorter weapon and it's generally held closer to the head. So this is less of a problem because I can still use this at really quite close range. However, a lot of the poleaxe techniques that we are familiar with from poleaxe treatises become very, very difficult when you're squished in with other people and you're trying not to hit the person in the face who's standing there as you go to swing your poleaxe, because you want to hit someone there and you smash your hammer or spike into the person who's standing next to you here. So this becomes, and that would go for any weapon, it's not just specific to the poleaxe. Using a weapon in a tight press is problematic. Now, funnily enough, in a tight press, a short weapon like a dagger can actually become eminently useful. And remember that knights at this time pretty much always have a dagger. However, if we now go to something like a short sword, if we're fighting in the press, it means that something like this is still super, super useful. And bear in mind that one of the disadvantages to a short weapon is that the opponent can hit you before you can hit them. Okay, so if you're just wearing a shirt, if you're just fighting unarmoured, as we mostly do in HEMA, it has to be said, and we mostly simulate that in HEMA. If you're going sword against spear, the spearman stabs you again and again and again. But what if the swordsman's now got armour on? Basically, you can walk towards the spearmen until you get close enough to hit them. Because as long as you keep things covered up and you don't let thrusts come into your face, most of the things which can hurt you with a spear can't hurt you through armour, and it's not very easy to find the gaps in the armour. So one of the best strategies if you are fully armoured is just basically to charge in as quickly as possible. Take a few hits on your armour as you go in, it's not going to hurt you. I didn't even feel any of the hits that landed on me at Tewkesbury. My armour completely did its job. I had a few scratches and one very minor, very, very minor dent. So people were hitting me. I didn't feel any of them at all. You can just charge in and get to shanking distance. So again, armour is the game changer. So the first point I want you to consider is that in the press, in a tight-in melee, polearms can become kind of useless. So there's a stage in the battle where they might be useful. There's types of opponents. So, you know, if you're using a spear against people who aren't wearing very much armour, but you are wearing armour, then absolutely the spear is going to be useful because you can be stabbing them all over the place. But if you are wearing armour and you get squished in, why hold a polearm at that point? You may as well have a short weapon that you can actually offend the other people more easily with. Now, the second point is related to what I've just said. As an armoured knight, regardless of whether you're fighting other armoured knights or whether most of your opponents are, for example, billmen who might have a brigandine and a salet and that's all of their armour. And historically, if we look at things like the Bridport muster rolls from 1457, they describe most people who arrived at muster, that means they're being called up to arrive with all their weapons and be checked out and make sure that they're fully equipped. Most of the people who arrived at muster simply had a jack, that's a padded jacket, and a helmet. That was it. That was all they had. So if you're a fully armoured knight, as I am, thankfully, and you're fighting people, let's say all of your opponents only have jacks and salets, what's the best strategy? It might be to stay with your men, but if you're a group of knights, it might be to barrel in. Now, if you barrel in, and that's something you can do with armour on, by barrel in I mean charge in that situation, I'll grab a different sword this time, let's grab this one. In that situation, getting to close range is what you want to do. So if you're barreling in to come within the range of their pole weapons, why would you yourself have a pole weapon? You wouldn't. You wouldn't choose a pole weapon. You'd choose the weapon that works best at the shortest range, because the shortest range is the range that you want to fight at, because that gives you the advantages and the opponent the disadvantage. Now, in terms of what type of weapon you hold, we're going to look at sword types towards the end of this video, and advantages and disadvantages of different sword types. But generally speaking, some type of sword that you can use in very close range. You could argue as well that something like a poleaxe can be used at very, very short range, and that's true. And bear in mind, although this poleaxe is about 6 feet tall, it's about the same as me, you do in our absolutely see shorter poleaxes than this. So if your strategy is to barrel in, any shorter weapon is probably going to be advantageous. 6 feet starts to get a little bit unwieldy in a close melee when you're barreling in. You might want to shorten your axe, and in fact we do see in medieval art sometimes what looks like a standard poleaxe where the shaft has been shortened, and they might be used at super short range, at half swording distance essentially, so much the same length as a long sword, or even a one-handed sword sometimes, because that's, for barreling in, that's the best length of weapon to have in that scenario. So let's narrow down the focus here and look at some specific advantages of swords in the press, either barreling and charging into the opponents deliberately because you're armoured and they might not be, or simply because that is what happens in the battle anyway. Let's look at some specific advantages of swords. So first of all, and most obviously, as we've mentioned, the sword is shorter than a polearm. Surprise, surprise. Therefore, if you are closer to the opponent, it is more nimble, it is more maneuverable. You can come in from angles that a polearm can't do, and it's just easier to maneuver around without hitting the people either side of you or behind you, and to get around the opponent, even in their back in some situations. So essentially, it's more nimble, more maneuverable in the close-in press. Next up, a sword can be used really quite easily, even if it's a long sword, in one hand. That means you have another hand free. Other hands are super useful for pushing, for pulling, for levering over, for throws, for arm locks and arm wraps and arm bars, for grabbing opponents' weapons, all of these sorts of things. So what it essentially means is you've gone from having one weapon to two weapons that can do completely different types of things. So while you're grabbing one opponent's weapon and stabbing them in the face, or pushing someone aside so you can stab them in the armpit, all of these types of things gives you a lot of tactical options with the sword in one hand. But you don't have to use it in one hand. If we put the messer down for a second and we pick up the longsword, if you want to use the longsword, yes, you can do all of those things that the one-handed sword can do. And remember, of course, strikes very close range with the pommel and the crossguard. But additionally, you can put your second hand onto that sword and you've got half swording. This has a huge amount of leverage. It means that you can stab more accurately and more strongly and effectively. You can instantly come around with the other side with the crossguard or the pommel. It makes you quite difficult to grapple with, quite difficult to contend with, essentially. So it becomes a very short polearm. So in that sense, what you're doing is you're replacing a traditional polearm with a super short, specialized, close range, armored fighting polearm. That can also, at an instant, become a cut and thrust weapon used at distance against lightly armoured opponents, or indeed can be used in close-in grappling as a one-handed weapon while you're using your left hand to push and grab and pull and all of these sorts of things as well. So incredibly diverse in its options and very versatile. Now, related to these previous 2 points and very specific to the age of plate armour is the ability for the sword to get into gaps. That's right. So one of the main ways to overcoming armoured opponents, if we say that our opponents are armoured rather than lightly armoured billmen or whatever, say they're actually other knights, the sword at close range, uniquely because of the angles you can get with it, or indeed if you're half swording, has the ability to get into those few vital gaps, the armpits, the crotch, anything around the helmet or neck that might be exposed or open, into the inside of the elbows, the back of the gauntlets, the inside of the hand, the back of the knees, the back of the hamstring, up the butt, all of these places which are exposed fighting in armour, well, or at least more vulnerable than the plated areas, you can get into more easily at close range with the sword than you'd ever be able to do with a polearm, because the polearm's longer, it has shallower angles, this can get really obtuse angles. The polearm is just simply not so easy to get into those little nooks and crannies as a short weapon like a dagger or a sword is. And the final big advantage of a sword, or indeed you could apply this to knives as well, and I've mentioned it in previous videos, I think that a lot of people don't necessarily think of, is it's more difficult to counter, grapple or grab. So if something is mostly made of handle or shaft, then surprise, surprise, it's quite easy for anyone to grab it. Yes, it's easy for you to hold because anything from the butt end to the head end can be utilized as a handle. But not only can it be utilized as a handle by you, that means it can also be utilized as a handle by your opponent. However, a sword only has a short handle and it has a lot of blade. And that's the same if we look at the Fairbairn Sykes dagger from World War II, Commando Dagger. One of the main reasons for it being edged, it wasn't really used to cut very much, one of the reasons for it being edged was so it was more difficult for an opponent to grab and control because it's mostly made of sharp blade. Something like this messer quite difficult to grab it when it's moving around nimbly and quickly, and it mostly consists of sharp blade. Remember, even in armour, the inside of your gauntlets are only leather gloves. So, more difficult to counter grapple than something like a polearm, especially at the close shanking distance that we're talking about here. So, hopefully I have sold you on some of the advantages for a knight using a sword in medieval warfare. And admittedly, some of my experience is anecdotal. It's from a HEMA background, or more recently from a reenactment background. But I think it tallies with the sources. It tallies with the descriptive accounts we've got. It tallies with the fencing treatises that we've got, the artistic sources and all sorts. So I think that triangulating and using lots of different information, modern experience plus historical data points, I think that I'm relatively close to the mark. You might have differing opinions, and as always, feel free to comment below. Now, just finally, I want to mention different types of swords. If you are a knight, if you're a knight fighting in full armour, what type of sword should you use? Well, I'm going to deal with a few examples. I've got 4 examples here. So first up, we have the Langmesser, okay, which usually is associated with lightly armoured or lightly equipped people or civilians. Next up, we've got a one-handed sword modelled on the so-called Henry V sword in Westminster Abbey. That wasn't Henry V's sword, but more about that in a future video. And this is, we could say, a specialised armoured fighting sword with a thick midrib and a reinforced point, but it's fairly short. And generally speaking, when we're talking about unarmoured fighting, we'd say that these short-ish swords have a disadvantage against longer bladed swords because of reduced reach. Now we've got a fairly typical longsword, which in this case is the Albion Ringeck. This is a cut and thrust sword, quite light for its size, quite nimble, quite good reach. And that kind of good kind of average of a 15th century longsword. And finally, we've got a specialised armoured fighting heavy longsword. This is a prototype, in fact, based on one of the Royal Armourers swords that will be in the new windlass line, Royal Armourers line that I've been working on. But it's got an especially thick, like 1 centimetre thick blade at the base, very, very rigid, difficult to flex. In my mind, absolutely built for armoured fighting, including a lot of half-swording. It's a fairly heavy sword, it's about 1800 grams for its size, so it's a fairly heavy sword. It's a very specialised armoured fighting sword. So, 4 different types of swords. So you might think that for fighting armour, we want this heavy bar, and it does offer lots of advantages. It is stiff, it's good for half-swording. That being said, it's not quite so nimble. It's a heavier sword. It's not going to cut particularly well because it's a thick cross section with a broad edge geometry. So it's never going to be a great cutting sword, particularly against lighter targets, but very, very effective at using like a short polearm and even striking with that big, robust, heavy pommel. So in many senses, you may say that this would be the advantageous sword for a knight to use in close combat. I couldn't disagree with you, and clearly this type of sword was a popular choice at the time. We know for a fact that lots of knights did choose that type of longsword, particularly in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, for fulfilling their roles, because it was a very good armoured sidearm, armoured fighting weapon. And it's possible that sometimes they chose to go in with that as opposed to using the spear or a poleaxe as a primary, that sometimes they just went in with the sword. There's some evidence of that being the case. Equally, this, in some ways, this is the one-handed equivalent of that, but notice that it has more cutting potential because it has a hollow ground mid-ribbed blade and a reinforced point. This is a little bit like the point of a rondel dagger married to the blade of a cutting sword. So why would this be the case? Well, I would suggest that this is a sword chosen by someone who wants a compromised design that is something you could use in a civilian situation, or it's something you could use against lightly armoured soldiers. If you've got a bunch of billmen that are only wearing a jack and a sallet, so their arms and their legs and their faces are exposed to cuts and thrusts, why not have a sword that can both cut well and, when you need it, can thrust through mail in the gusset of an armoured knight's armpit as well. So this is kind of fulfilling both criteria, but it's not as stiff as the other one, it's not as long as the other one, it's not as heavy as the other one. So it's maybe not going to be so good in the specialised armoured fighting role, but it's going to be better in a general role. I would also say that that's true of the Ringeck. So the Ringeck, what we've really got between these two, they're both compromised designs that can cut and thrust. One's a two-handed, one's a one-handed. Now, this comes back to the question of how you like to fight in the close press. So the disadvantage of the longsword, let's start with the advantage. The advantage of the longsword is you've got more space to half sword with it. Okay, so if you're going to fight in half swording predominantly, you've still got a pommel sticking out to hook with. You've got quite a lot of hilt to hook with. You've got a longer overall weapon, and you've got more space to put your hand on the blade and effectively half sword with this thing and still have a decent length weapon. With a very small one-handed sword like this, if you half sword with it, it's got a broader blade, so it's more difficult to half sword with. In fact, really quite uncomfortable to half sword with because the blade's quite broad. Narrower blades are easy to half sword with. And you've got a ridiculously short thing if you half sword with it. So I would say between these two, why choose one, why choose the other? Do you prefer to fight with a sword in one hand and use the left hand for grappling, grabbing, pushing, disarming, all of this kind of thing? Do you prefer to fight like this, or do you prefer to fight like this? If you prefer to fight half sword, use a long sword. If you prefer to fight using your left hand for grabbing and grappling, then use a one-handed sword. And finally, I would say possibly the worst choice for an armoured knight is the Langmesser, because the Langmesser really is a thin, flexible blade. It's rubbish for half swording. You can't grip it. I mean, you can grip it at the back like that, and there are half swording techniques shown with Langmesser in unarmoured contexts. But it's not a very rigid blade, it's not a very long blade, it's not got a reinforced point in this case, so it's not going to be, and it's quite broad, so it's not going to be very effective at thrusting through mail or into gaps. It's going to get stuck in gaps, it's going to get stuck in mail. So really, this is rubbish, I would say, although we know knights did carry them, it's shown in artwork and referred to in sources. This is rubbish for fighting another armoured knight. But if you know that you're very unlikely to fight another armoured knight, and maybe your primary weapon is a poleaxe, so maybe your primary weapon is a poleaxe and that's what you're intending to hit other knights with, but this really is a backup for if you find yourself surrounded by lightly armed militia or something like that, who again are wearing basically clothes and a helmet. In that case, in your plate armour, you can go wading into them and carve them up all day and thrust through their jacks and thrust into their clothing with no concerns, and this will be a very effective weapon at that. So again, it all comes back to context. What type of opponents are you expecting to fight? How are you expecting to fight? How are you trained, and how do you prefer to fight? I hope this has been thought-provoking and illuminating. I will have more insights and more ideas that have been spawned on the battlefield of Tewkesbury recently, and check out that link below for that special offer to established titles. Thanks again to them for sponsoring this video, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!